So if my SP404 Mark II broke today, would I buy it again? Well, after 5 years, firmware updates, and hundreds of beats made on this thing, that's a more complicated question than it seems, because the SP I've been using for the last 5 years isn't the same as the one when I first bought it. It's not even the same as a couple years ago. Some parts have aged incredibly well, some things are only held up because of firmware updates, and there are still a few things that honestly drive me crazy every time I turn it on. So let's get into it. Alright, so we're gonna start with what aged well. And the biggest reason this thing is still here 5 years later is just because of how many roles it can fill in a studio. I always like to call it a sort of studio chameleon. It's not necessarily the best at any role, but it can do basically any role you throw at it. If you need a sampler, it definitely works for that. If you need performance effects, it's got a ton of those. If you even need a looper or an amp sim for your guitar, it's got that. And of course, with the pattern sequencing, DJ mode, and even just long sample times, it's pretty good for building beats and great at live sets. And that versatility is what's kept it on my desk and the primary sampler or even brain of all of my setups for the last 5 years. It's also just a very playable machine. Each pad can hold up to 16 minutes. There's all sorts of ways you can link pads together or mutes, chromatic mode. Then you add in things like skip back recording, DJ mode, and the looper. And this stops feeling like just a sampler and more like an instrument. But here's the thing, most of those features I've mentioned were not on the SP on day one. There were a few things, obviously the long sample times, sample chopping, that sort of stuff was there, but things like the looper, chromatic mode, even some effects have all come with updates. So at launch, it was promising, but it wasn't complete, and it's not the SP we look at today. And one of the biggest shifts, at least for me personally, was the playability. Once they added chromatic mode, it opened up the SP to being a lot more than just sample playback, becoming much more like an instrument. You could turn on chromatic mode for any sample. Then Roland added the TR rec mode, which really helped to bridge the gap between the SP's sample playback and something like a sequencer. It's not perfect, but the TR rec mode is a decent sequencer. It's not as powerful as something like the Roland P6, which is just always crazy to me because the P6 is a smaller, more limited, and cheaper sampler, and yet its sequencer just does laps around TR rec mode. But if you want to program beats, have quantize on things you're recording in, and even do things like ghost notes or change velocities on steps, things like that, sub-steps, it can do all of that pretty well. For me though, one of the biggest updates was actually the looper. It's not as powerful as something like the RC505 where you can control different loop layers. It is limited, but there's a lot of fun to be had in using it, and it's one of the fastest workflows on the SP. And honestly, the place I would recommend anyone new to the SP to start, because you can learn all sorts of functions, but it's easy to start right with, okay, I'm just layering loop on top of loop. With the looper, I can jam ideas quickly. You don't even have to be set to a BPM. There is a way that you can just hit record, and as soon as you want the loop to just start looping, hit record again, and it'll just guess approximately what BPM it's at, but it just loops endlessly with the way you've set it. That's a great way to just quickly get down some drums and then start jamming. Similar to the looper, and something that was on the SP from the beginning, is the skip back recorder. Skip back is great if you don't typically use the looper, but you like to jam into the SP or even just play on the SP without hitting record. You can call back the last 40 seconds of whatever has come through the SP by hitting that skip back button and turn it into a sample. Now, something I think is pretty underrated with the SP, and I will continue to talk about it because I think it is a very powerful, though clunky, addition to the SP, is the sound generator. This was added in our 4.04 update a couple of years back, and if you're just using it on the sound generator setting, it's really just raw waveforms and a monophonic synth. But if you resample it and throw it through a bunch of different effects and use the envelopes built in for every sample, you can create a sort of synthesizer. It is a very powerful tool. I do a lot of songs with just internal sound generator sounds. And last but not least, they even expanded integration with software like Koala Sampler and Serato, which has really expanded what you can do with the SP and also reduced some of its limitations. With Serato, you can have stem splitting, you can do additional DJing, but with Koala Sampler, which is the one I've used it with, it just makes both pieces of gear far more complete. Every issue you have with one of them kind of gets solved when you add them together, and it's just a really fun workflow. I recommend everyone try it. All you need is Koala, USB-C cable, and the SP. As soon as you connect it, it works. I also have a video on that. You can check it out. I'll put links in the description if you want to see them. So yeah, firmware didn't just fix bugs. It fundamentally changed what the SP is. And that's why the SP in 2026 is nothing like the SP I bought day one. But this is also where the cracks start to show. And while they've added so many things, all of those features added a lot of button combos to know, just all sorts of menus to remember. Muscle memory is quite a thing on the SP. And so let's talk a little bit about what still hasn't changed and some of the flaws on the SP. The SP rewards muscle memory, but it also punishes forgetfulness. Almost everything you want to get to on the SP is some sort of a button combo. If you're in pattern sequence and you want to mute pads, you can do that, but you have to hold shift reverse to open up the quick mute mode. And then if you wanted to keep that up while it's playing, hold shift reverse remain. One function I love to use is the groove function they added, but because of where it's placed in the menus, I almost always forget to use it. This is basically adding glitch and groove, like humanizing elements to a sample. In drastic settings, you can get some really cool glitch sounds that you could chop up. Now let's test out though what it can do to some sort of ambient sound, right? So I've got this simple sound and we've got it looping. So let's go into that groove. We'll change the rate. It's pretty trippy. I don't necessarily use it on drums, but I love to use it on drones to just get glitching and stuff. But to get to it, you have to do something like go to pitch speed on the SP and then hit roll, and that opens it up. Once you know the shortcuts, it opens up all kinds of options on the SP. But if you forget them, you'll be looking on YouTube trying to remember how to do it. There's also some things like effects that I think the SP community has been asking for quite a while, like sidechain. So I wanted to give a quick update as I'm editing this. Roland did announce a sidechain compression feature being added to the SP404 in the 5.5 update. Now, this hasn't come out yet while I'm recording this. It's April 2nd and it's only 1 p.m. and it's supposed to come out at 5. So let me know in the comments if you've given it a shot. Another thing too, we'll talk about it more in a second, but things like per pad filters would be huge just to allow for a little more nuanced and clean mixes on the SP. If every pad could have just a high and low pass filter, you could cut out a lot of the muddiness in things that don't have bass but still have some kind of low-end frequencies. And this was resolved on the Roland P6, but it's not on the SP. So that brings me actually to the biggest thing I think that's still missing or at least lacking on the SP, and that's sequencing. We talked about the P6 already and how certain things on the P6 solved issues or things that were lacking on the SP. And this is, I think, the biggest one. The SP's TR Rec mode is functional. It works. I use it quite a lot, and it is decent at what it does. It's not laid out as cleanly as something like on the P6, which of course seems like it was designed with that in mind, so it's built into the UI to a degree. But something like the P6 or the Digitact with a very powerful step sequencer that you can go in and do all sorts of parameter locks on a per step basis is what feels very lacking on the SP and keeps it feeling a bit dated. On the P6, you can go in and you can parameter lock all sorts of functions, effects, volume to just every step on your step sequencer. P6 has its issues too. You can't actually do manual chops, which you can on the SP. So they have kind of a push-pull relationship in how they work. If I had to choose one really quickly, side tangent, but I would go with the SP, much more power, much more flexibility in terms of just being a jack of all trades or studio chameleon. The last thing I want to mention is multi-track audio over USB. A lot of hardware since the SP has come out utilizes this. And it's awesome because if you do record into a DAW, everything is separated as an audio track, whether you record just a loop or a full session, they would all be separate audio tracks that you could then mix in post far more nuanced than just mixing on the fly while you're making the song. The SP again has a ton of samples. I understand the limitations, but I think something that could work would be having the individual bus effects, the input effect, bus 1, bus 2, and then maybe bus 3 and 4 combined, and maybe a dry signal. Those could all be separate audio tracks. And just think, if you have your drums on bus 2, samples on bus 1, maybe a live instrument on the input effect, you now have tons of different options for mixing. Sure, it may not be as controlled as having everything as a separate audio track, but it would give you a lot more flexibility if afterwards you go, you know what, that sample was too loud. Well, now you can just lower it. Now, I do have one workaround that I use for this, and that's stem splitting. If you have a DAW like Logic or even MPC, those can stem split. Now, there are issues with that. There's some artifacting sometimes, but more importantly, it's not the most nuanced. Logic is one of the better ones I've found because it now separates guitar, piano, other melodic sounds. Those are 3 separate stems: bass, vocals, and drums. So you do get a little more control. So like with the looper, try as I'm building the loop to think about each layer. So I do a guitar, I do the melodic sounds, a piano, a bass, drums, and then if there's vocals or something, because when you stem split, if you've done it in a way that complements how Logic splits the stems into those 6 tracks, you now have most of the sounds separated for easier mixing. My biggest problem with that though is usually I play the hi-hats too loud and then there's nothing to do but maybe add a filter to the drums, but that's my own problem. But that is an option if you do that. So that brings us back to that first question. If my SP404 broke today, would I buy another one? So here's the thing. The SP404 Mark II is not the best at any of the things it can do. It's not the deepest sequencer. It's not the most advanced looper. It's not the most flexible DJ tool, but it does all of those things in one box for under $600. And that's why I still think of it as my studio chameleon. So would I buy another one? Yes. Not because it's perfect, but because there's no other box I've found that can do all of this in a way that just clicks for me. And if you want to make the most out of the SP and all of its many functions, you can check out my SP404 Mark II cheat sheet right here. And if you want to see my full workflow for making beats on the SP, check out this video next. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.